You know the old saying, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. It's not just a throwaway line, they really mean it. We all remember the Salem witch trials from our history books, where a frenzy of moral panic and power grabs led to the execution of 19 innocent people. Hell, Europe wasn't much better, with an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 people losing their lives in similar trials. But that was ages ago, right? A time when the spread of information was a slow, creaky process and people had too much time on their hands. Surely something like that could never happen in our modern world. Could it? Oh, but it did. Fast forward to 1980s America, a new, distinctly modern kind of moral panic was brewing, and this time it came with a terrifying twist. The Satanic Panic. Suddenly, a dangerous wave of fear gripped the country as people, fueled by paranoia, became convinced that satanic cults were secretly lurking in the shadows, performing horrifying rituals and threatening society's very fabric. Religious groups, law enforcement, and concerned citizens alike began to demonize anything remotely connected to the occult. Even the most innocent activities, role-playing games, heavy metal music, occult imagery, were blamed for corrupting the youth. By the late 1990s, the panic had spiraled into something much bigger, stretching beyond US borders. Thousands of baseless accusations of satanic ritual abuse were made, with no real evidence to back them up. Murders, suicides, and disappearances were inexplicably tied to cult-like activity, and before long, the outcasts, those who were different, became the easy targets of this hysteria. But even though there were no mass executions like in Salem, the damage was real. People's lives were destroyed by nothing more than fear and false accusations. So, what in the world sparked the Satanic Panic? It wasn't some single, isolated event. No, it was more like a perfect storm of factors colliding at just the right moment. A confluence of politics, media, and social changes set the stage for one of the most bizarre chapters in modern history. First, let's take a look at the rise of conservatism in America during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Ronald Reagan's presidency, starting in 1981, marked a backlash against the progressive social movements of the 60s and 70s. There was a palpable unease among white, middle-class Americans as the country grappled with new civil rights victories, changing gender roles, and rising liberalism. The old order was crumbling, and many were uncomfortable with what was replacing it. This insecurity created a fertile ground for moral crusades. A wave of fundamentalist Christianity surged in popularity, and with it came an aggressive politicization of religion. People began to believe that society was under attack, not just by communists or liberal elites, but by something far more sinister. Satanism, they thought, was creeping into the very soul of the nation. Simultaneously, the horror genre in media, especially films, was evolving. In the late 60s and 70s, films like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Omen brought satanic imagery into mainstream consciousness. For many, these films weren't just fiction, they felt like a dire warning. They tapped into a cultural fear that something malevolent and supernatural could be lurking in the shadows. Then, there was the small but influential rise of occultism itself. A book like Michelle Remembers, claiming to expose real satanic ritual abuse, was the perfect storm of paranoia and sensationalism. It wasn't just a creepy story, it was presented as evidence that the satanic threat was real, making it even harder for people to separate fact from fiction. In addition, the infamous Tate LaBianca murders in 1969, committed by Charles Manson and his followers, played a critical role. The gruesome, ritualistic nature of the killings became a chilling symbol of the violence that satanic cults were allegedly capable of. It was the kind of spectacle that the media couldn't ignore, and it fed the collective fear that a wave of satanic terror was sweeping the country. It wasn't just the murders, though. The media's tendency to sensationalize and dramatize these events made it nearly impossible to separate fact from fear. The more these stories spread, the more ingrained the idea of satanic cults in the public imagination became. By now, you've probably realized that the media played a huge role in fueling the panic. I mean, it was practically a feeding frenzy. The public was eager to buy into the idea that satanic cults were everywhere, hiding in plain sight, lurking behind every corner, waiting to pounce. It wasn't just films either. The growing influence of heavy metal bands in the late 70s and early 80s didn't help matters either. As the heavy riffs and rebellious lyrics of bands like Black Sabbath and Judas Priest gained popularity, concerned parents and religious leaders began to point fingers, claiming that this devil's music was brainwashing their children. Even role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, which were intended as harmless fantasy entertainment, became part of the satanic threat. The game involved casting spells, battling demons, and using occult symbolism, so to the paranoid, it was a clear sign that kids were being groomed for satanic rituals. The media jumped on this, amplifying every negative story they could find. One particularly tragic story involved the disappearance of a brilliant but troubled teenager, James Dallas Egbert III. In 1979, after he went missing from his university, a private investigator blamed his disappearance on Dungeons & Dragons, claiming the game had driven him to flee into the tunnels of the university. Of course, the real reasons behind his actions had more to do with personal struggles and mental health issues, but the media jumped at the chance to sensationalize it. A few years later, another suicide, this time that of Lee Pulling, was similarly blamed on D&D, even though there was no evidence to support this. It wasn't just fiction and games that became the target. Media outlets pounced on any story that seemed to hint at satanic involvement. The idea of satanic ritual abuse was starting to take hold, and the media, eager for a scandal, ran with it. The line between fact and fiction became increasingly blurred, and soon there was a belief widespread and unchallenged that Satanism was a real, tangible force in society. Now, let's talk about Michelle Remembers. This book, published in 1980, is often seen as one of the cornerstones of the Satanic Panic. Written by Canadian psychiatrist Lawrence Pasder and his wife Michelle Smith, it claimed to recount Michelle's childhood trauma at the hands of a satanic cult. The book was presented as a memoir, detailing horrific abuse at the hands of her own mother, abuse so severe, it supposedly involved Satan himself. According to Michelle, she had been tortured for days by a group of Satan-worshipping cultists. At one point, she claimed that a portal to hell opened up, with Satan himself appearing to torment her. The abuse only stopped when, as the story goes, the Virgin Mary and Archangel Michael intervened to drive the devil away. But here's the thing, there was no physical evidence to support Michelle's story. No scars, no bruises, nothing. Yet the book was marketed as a real, first-hand account of satanic ritual abuse. So why did it take off? One reason is that it played into people's deepest fears. In an era where religious zealotry and conspiracy theories were gaining steam, Michelle Remembers gave the idea of satanic abuse a form and a face. It was a nightmare come true for those who already feared that dark forces were at work in society. What's even more alarming is that Michelle Remembers wasn't just read by the public. It became a manual for law enforcement and prosecutors dealing with allegations of satanic ritual abuse. Pasder went on to give lectures to police and social workers, spreading the idea of ritual abuse and encouraging them to look for signs of it in their investigations. But over time, the truth began to come out. Michelle's father and two of her sisters publicly denied her allegations, claiming that nothing of the sort had ever happened. Additionally, an old yearbook from Michelle's school, dated to the very period when she claimed to have been imprisoned by her mother, showed her as a healthy, normal child. None of this stopped the panic from spreading, though. As the book's popularity grew, so did the number of allegations of ritual abuse, most of which turned out to be either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Yet the idea that satanic cults were operating in secret and were systematically abusing children became firmly entrenched in the public consciousness. The McMartin preschool trial is one of the most notorious and tragic examples of the Satanic Panic in action. In 1983, a mother named Judy Johnson reported to the police that her young son had been sexually abused by her estranged husband and Ray Buckey, a teacher at the McMartin preschool in California. The boy allegedly told his mother about the abuse, and soon other children were questioned. What followed was a cascade of bizarre, unfounded allegations. Some children claimed to have witnessed unimaginable horrors, everything from animal mutilation to seeing teachers flying through the air and participating in satanic rituals. Some kids even said they'd been forced to travel in hot air balloons and had been molested by prominent figures, including movie stars. One child even claimed that Chuck Norris was the abuser. Despite the fact that there was no physical evidence to back up any of these allegations, the case snowballed. It quickly became a public spectacle, and law enforcement, social workers, and the media were all complicit in turning it into a full-blown moral panic. In the months following Johnson's accusation, nearly 200 parents were sent letters warning them that their children may have been victims of abuse at the McMartin preschool. The Children's Institute International, a group that specialized in interviewing children in abuse cases, was brought in. The interviews were highly suggestive, using leading questions that sometimes prompted children to make statements that fit the narrative of satanic abuse. It's worth noting that many of the children initially resisted implicating anyone or giving details of abuse. Still, under intense and often coercive questioning, over 360 children ended up making accusations. The way these interviews were conducted was deeply problematic. Clinical psychologist Michael P. Maloney later reviewed video footage of the interviews and criticized the tactics, saying that the children were often pressured into providing details that weren't their own. Instead of letting the children tell their stories, the interviewers directed them, suggesting who the abusers might be and what had allegedly happened. Many of the accusations were bizarre, such as claims of witches flying or being taken to underground tunnels for ritual abuse. Despite the lack of physical evidence and the highly questionable nature of the children's testimonies, a trial began in 1987. Ray Buckey, his mother Peggy McMartin Buckey, and several other teachers were charged with a staggering 321 counts of child abuse. The trial was an ordeal that lasted several years, stretching into 1990. After years of sensationalized media coverage, the McMartin preschool trial ultimately ended without a conviction. Despite the sheer number of accusations, none of the defendants were found guilty of any of the charges. The jury deliberated for months, but the lack of concrete evidence and the contradictory testimonies of the children were impossible to ignore. Ray Buckey, who had been at the center of the storm, was eventually acquitted of all charges. His mother, Peggy McMartin Buckey, was also exonerated, but the damage was done. Their lives were ruined by the allegations, and even though they had been cleared of wrongdoing, the public's perception of them had already been irrevocably shaped. But the fallout didn't end with the trial's conclusion. The McMartin case was a key moment in the Satanic Panic. It was a symbol of how the moral hysteria could tear apart families, communities, and reputations based on little more than mass hysteria. The trial's failure to secure any convictions should have been a wake-up call. But instead, it marked the beginning of more witch hunts, more false accusations, and a continued erosion of trust in the judicial system. And what about the children who were caught up in this mess? Many of them were pressured to give testimonies they didn't fully understand or even remember. Years later, many of them would speak out about how they had been manipulated into making up stories of satanic abuse. But at the time, their words were treated as gospel, and the parents who had questioned their kids were seen as protectors in a society terrified of unseen evil. For the families involved, the ordeal wasn't just a blip in history. It was a formative experience, one that left emotional scars and created lasting trauma. Even after the trial ended, the accusations would continue to linger over their heads, as though the shadow of the Satanic Panic would never truly fade. In May 1993, three 8-year-old boys Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were reported missing in West Memphis, Arkansas. The next day, their bodies were discovered in a creek, hogtied with their own shoelaces and stripped naked. One of the boys had been mutilated, adding to the horror of the situation. The crime was horrific, and the community was in shock. At first, there were no clear suspects, and the investigation was slow. But as time passed, law enforcement turned to the idea that the killings had a ritualistic nature, believing it to be linked to Satanism, a theory that gained traction quickly. Soon, 3 teenagers, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, became the primary suspects. Their involvement in the case wasn't based on any solid evidence, but rather on the fact that they were seen as outsiders. Echols, in particular, was an easy target, as he was a teenager with a deep interest in the occult, goth culture, and dark, unconventional beliefs. None of this was enough to prove their guilt. But in the climate of moral panic that had taken hold across the U.S. during the Satanic Panic, the authorities were eager to find an explanation for the horrific murders, and Satanism seemed to fit the bill. Despite the absence of physical evidence tying the 3 teens to the crime scene, and despite Miskelly's confession being deeply flawed, he had an IQ of 72, was interrogated for over 12 hours, and his statement was contradictory. The boys were convicted. Echols was sentenced to death, Baldwin to life in prison, and Miskelly received a 40-year sentence. For 18 years, they remained behind bars, victims of a moral panic that had taken hold of the public imagination, fueled by irrational fear and sensationalism. The West Memphis Three were convicted not on real evidence, but on the paranoia of an era that was obsessed with the idea of satanic ritual abuse. It wasn't until 2008 that DNA testing on evidence found at the crime scene cast doubt on their convictions. In 2011, after a lengthy legal battle, the West Memphis Three were released from prison after entering an Alford plea, meaning they maintained their innocence, but acknowledged that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict them. The West Memphis Three spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, victims of a moral panic that led to a miscarriage of justice. When you think about the Satanic Panic, you can't ignore the shadow cast by Charles Manson and his family. In 1969, Manson and his followers committed a series of gruesome murders that would leave a permanent mark on American culture and play a role in the moral hysteria surrounding Satanism. Manson was a product of the 1960s counterculture, a time of social upheaval and rebellion. He attracted followers, mostly young, disillusioned women, by preaching about a coming apocalyptic race war. His teachings were a mishmash of bizarre, distorted beliefs, borrowing heavily from his interpretation of the Bible and the philosophy of the Process Church of the Final Judgment, which claimed that Satan and Christ would reconcile at the end of the world. Manson convinced his followers that they were reincarnations of the original Christians, and that the world was on the verge of an apocalyptic race war. His followers were convinced that they were doing the Lord's work when they brutally murdered actress Sharon Tate and 4 others on August 9, 1969. The following night, Manson's group killed another couple, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. These murders were brutal, bloody, and carried out in a ritualistic manner, with messages written in blood on the walls, making it seem, to some, like an act of satanic worship. The murders terrified the nation, and for many, they were proof of the existence of a dangerous, underground satanic cult capable of the most horrific violence. The Manson family murders weren't just shocking because of the brutality, they confirmed the worst fears of the era. The media coverage sensationalized the satanic aspects of the crime, linking Manson and his followers to a larger, sinister network of Satan-worshipping cults. Manson, with his apocalyptic visions and his followers' unquestioning obedience, became a symbol of everything people feared about the rise of cults and Satanism. Though Manson's followers weren't part of a larger, organized satanic movement, their crimes became a touchstone for the growing panic. The murders, with their ritualistic elements, were seen as evidence that satanic groups had infiltrated American society. The specter of Manson's violent cult loomed large in the minds of many, shaping perceptions of Satanism as a dangerous and pervasive threat. So, who were the real victims of the Satanic Panic? It's not a simple answer because, in many ways, everyone who was caught up in it suffered to some degree. The hysteria that swept across the country destroyed lives, careers, and reputations. It didn't just harm the falsely accused, it also harmed society's ability to recognize and address real issues. Take, for instance, the case of Frances and Dan Keller, 2 daycare workers in Oak Hill, Texas. In 1991, they were accused of satanic ritual abuse, with allegations ranging from forcing children to drink blood-laced Kool-Aid to participating in animal dismemberment. There was no physical evidence to support any of these claims, And even the child who originally sparked the investigation later recanted, saying no abuse had occurred. Nevertheless, Frances and Dan were convicted and sentenced to 48 years in prison. It wasn't until 2013 that their case was re-examined, and in 2017, all charges were dropped. By then, the Kellers had already lost years of their lives to a moral panic that had no foundation in reality. But the Kellers weren't the only ones. Daycare workers, teachers, and even family members across the country were falsely accused and imprisoned based on little more than unsubstantiated claims, sometimes even from children who were coached into making statements they didn't fully understand. The Kellers case also highlighted a major problem that came out of the Satanic Panic. It diverted attention from real cases of child abuse. Instead of focusing on actual cases of neglect and violence, society became fixated on the idea of satanic ritual abuse, which was often exaggerated or entirely fabricated. The resulting panic caused law enforcement and social workers to misdirect their energies, casting a shadow over the very real suffering of children who weren't caught up in the hysteria. The Satanic Panic also had a major impact on child testimony. As the years went on, many of the kids who had been involved in these investigations began to speak out about how they had been manipulated. They admitted that they had been pressured or even coerced into making false statements. Many had never experienced any abuse, yet they had been forced to give accounts of ritualistic horrors that simply weren't true. These false memories, created through leading questions and suggestive interviews, would eventually damage the credibility of children's testimonies in future abuse cases. Though it all started in the United States, the Satanic Panic didn't stay confined to American soil. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the moral hysteria spread to other parts of the world, with several countries reporting similar cases of satanic ritual abuse. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavia all saw their own waves of panic, driven by the same set of fears and false memories. In 1986, Australia held the largest symposium on child abuse in its history. The conference featured multiple speakers promoting the idea of satanic ritual abuse, further cementing the idea that Satanism was a global threat. Even Switzerland, usually seen as a more reserved country, wasn't immune. In the 2020s, reports from journalists revealed that some high-ranking Swiss police officers and doctors still held on to the belief in satanic cults and ritual abuse. These conspiracy theories, once dismissed as fringe ideas, had taken root in pockets of society around the world, often supported by individuals in positions of authority. The international spread of the Satanic Panic shows how fear can cross borders. Once an idea takes hold, no matter how baseless it may be, it can quickly spread through cultures and societies, especially when combined with sensational media coverage. These false beliefs not only disrupted lives, but they also helped solidify the idea of an insidious, global satanic conspiracy that didn't exist. As quickly as it began, the Satanic Panic began to lose steam. By the mid-1990s, many people started to question the validity of the widespread accusations of satanic ritual abuse. Public perception shifted as more and more criminal cases fell apart under scrutiny. The sheer lack of evidence, the imploding testimonies, and the growing number of exonerations began to erode the moral panic that had once gripped the nation. The public's skepticism was further fueled by the increasing number of lawsuits filed against mental health professionals and investigators who had used suggestive and coercive interviewing techniques. These cases helped reveal how unreliable the methods used to extract confessions really were, and how easily they could create false memories in vulnerable individuals. In 1995, the release of the HBO TV movie Indictment, the McMartin trial painted Ray Buckey as a victim of the panic rather than a perpetrator. His case became a symbol of the way in which false accusations and mass hysteria could lead to devastating consequences. Around the same time, TV host Geraldo Rivera, who had previously aired a sensational 1987 special on satanic cults, publicly apologized for his role in stoking the panic. The turning point came when renowned scientist Carl Sagan weighed in on the issue in his 1996 book, The Demon-Haunted World: Science as a Candle in the Dark. Sagan criticized the use of recovered memory therapy, a controversial technique that had played a major role in the panic. He explained how the therapy, which often used hypnosis to recover memories, could implant false memories in the minds of patients. Many of the memories recovered in these sessions were eerily similar to scenes from horror films, further casting doubt on the validity of the satanic ritual abuse claims. If history teaches us anything, it's that moral panics are not just a relic of the past. They can resurface, and they can spread quickly, especially in times of uncertainty. The key to preventing another satanic panic, or any similar moral hysteria, is a commitment to critical thinking, skepticism, and an understanding of the dangers that come from letting fear dictate our actions.